All right, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. I'm Dr. Kay Stefanik, Assistant Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. I want to welcome you all to our last seminar in our Spring 2026 series, Status of Nutrient Reduction Strategies in Upper Mississippi River Basin States. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping items. First, please type your questions into the chat box and I will read them to the speaker at the end of the presentation. Second, this webinar will be recorded and posted to the INRC's website along with previous seminars. So on to today's talk. Today's speaker is Julie Harrold. Julie is the Program Manager for the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program and Water Quality Initiatives for the Indiana State Department of Agriculture, Division of Soil Conservation. As the Program Manager, Julie provides leadership and management for the Indiana CREP, the Indiana State Nutrient Reduction Strategy, and other water quality initiatives undertaken by the ISDA. She also provides Indiana representation on the Gulf of America Hypoxia Task Force Coordinating Committee. Julie is a graduate of Purdue University with a degree in Landscape Horticulture and Design and has over 27 years of experience as a conservation professional. She has held a number of different positions within the Division of Soil Conservation and has been in her current position as Program Manager since July of 2015. She will be presenting on Indiana State Nutrient Reduction Strategy, programs, practices, and priorities. All right, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction there, Kay. Appreciate it. And thank you for inviting me to speak today as part of this webinar series. I appreciate the opportunity. Make sure. Okay, there it goes. Making sure my slide was advancing. Okay, so whenever I do a presentation about our state nutrient reduction strategy, I like to include this statement that our strategy was to develop to capture statewide present and future endeavors in Indiana, which positively impact our state's waters, as well as document the progress of conservation, water quality improvements, and the adoption of soil health and edge of field practices in Indiana. Our strategy development is co-led by the Indiana State Department of Agriculture as well as the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, but it is contributed to by many members of different organizations, conservation organizations, commodity groups in the state. We have a state nutrient reduction strategy work group that is made up of many different partners in the state, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But there's just wanted to point out there's as you guys know, even with the development of other state strategies, there's a lot of work that goes into developing these and lots of partners that help with that development. Excuse me. So first of all, I just wanted to touch here that there's a touch on Indiana in the drainage areas. There are three major drainage basins in the state of Indiana. The blue area drains to the Mississippi River through the Wabash and White rivers, through the Ohio River along the southern border, and then through the Kankakee River that drains to Illinois. And then the area shaded in yellow drains to Lake Michigan, and the area shaded in green drains to Lake Erie. So with the creation of our strategy, it does encompass all waters of the state that not only drain down to the Gulf, but that also drain to our Great Lakes. So what I'm going to touch on today, I've just listed here some of the topics that I'm going to discuss today, and I'm going to highlight or discuss the timeline of the development of our strategy, highlight some of the updates that was made to our recent strategy, discuss what the strategy sections or different components are, and discuss a little bit about each one, discuss how our partners are key to success, discuss our new priority watersheds that we developed, and discuss our science assessment as well as some of our goals and action items that we have, and also discuss programs that we have available, and then how we measure impacts from all of the different efforts under our strategy. So first of all, here, Indiana, here's a kind of timeline of how we developed our strategy. Indiana became a member of the Hypoxia Task Force in July of 2010. And then there was a lot of work done between 2010 to October of 2015 when we released our original strategy in October 2015. And then again, several more between 2015 to now. There have been several updates or revised versions that we've completed. To be exact, we've had 3 versions in between that time frame where we've done updates and released those. Our most recent release was worked on in 2025 this past year, and we just recently released it in March of 2026. So this presentation is fresh for me as far as any updates in our most recent strategy. So our updates are on a 5-year rotation. So our next update will be in 2030 and 2031, and around that time frame. And then as far as working with having public comments, we have an ongoing strategy email that is on our website where we can receive on public comments at any time. They can be received at any time. Okay, so highlighting some of the updates that we've made in our strategy. In the most recent strategy, there is an update on the progress that we've made in the Mississippi River Basin, both within the Hypoxia Task Force and also within Indiana in relation to our water quality monitoring and our trends. We did a reassessment of our priority watersheds, where all 38 Huc 8 watersheds in the state were prioritized according to a tiered system. And then we had an update on the progress of our Indiana Science Assessment, where we are determining water quality trends within the state, and then also determining the effectiveness of conservation practices on improving water quality. Another update in our recent release was we re-emphasized the importance of a system of conservation practices. Since each practice treats nutrients differently, a system of conservation practices helps treat nutrient runoff more effectively. And then we had an update to the multiple programs and initiatives that we have available to support nutrient reduction. And then also we had an update on how we measure progress and share success stories. So the Indiana strategy talks about the metric that the Hypoxia Task Force uses to show progress of water quality improvements in the Mississippi River Basin and towards the Hypoxia Task Force's goal. The metric that they use, or the model that they use to show this metric, is the weighted regressions on time, discharge, and season, the WRDIS model. This model determines loads and concentrations and then shows trends in water quality. Our first published or released strategy in 2015 did not talk about water quality trends. It was included in the later version. We had a lot of information in there about some of the water quality monitoring going on in our state by the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, but we did not specifically talk about water quality trends and how we were doing in our state. But the 2018 version, that was when we first started talking about these water quality trends. And it is still included in our most recent update as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about those trends here soon. So our strategy does have information in it in the intro section about how the task force is doing towards the goal. So what you're seeing here on this slide and the next slide, this is the total nitrogen graph for the total load going to the Gulf from the Mississippi River Basin. This is down at the Hypoxia site down at the bottom of the basin. And it shows that the task force has met the 2025 interim goal. But it does also show that, it makes you think and as you guys know, there are many factors that contribute to whether there's a decrease or an increase. And fortunately, we have met the goal. The task force has met the goal, but we know that there still is much more work that needs to be done. This graph here shows the total phosphorus loads, and it shows that phosphorus is actually increasing, which of course means that there's more work that needs to be done, and the science behind all this and the factors that contribute to this can be pretty complicated. So for the Indiana strategy, we wanted to pretty much have the same process in determining our loads and trends. We wanted to mirror what the state nutrient reduction, or excuse me, what the Hypoxia task force is doing. So we also used the WordUs model, and we began doing this in our 2018 version. And what you're seeing here is the most recent update that we've done to include data up through 2025. So at this particular site, this is down at New Harmony, Indiana, which is on the Wabash River. It is the last site on the Wabash River before it leaves Indiana and enters into the Ohio River. And the trend data that we have from there is from 1997 to 2025. It shows that our total nitrogen load is going down, that we have a pretty good downward trend. But it is showing that our total phosphorus load is actually slightly increasing. So when we do exercises like this, it tells us the areas where more work needs to be done. We've expanded this work through our Indiana Science Assessment to cover more areas of the state, and I'll talk about more of that later. Oops, did I skip? Nope. Okay, sorry. So the strategy components that we have within our strategies sections or components, depending on how you want to look at it. We have several of them, and I've listed them here. We engage our stakeholders and our partners. I've already mentioned about having partners is key. So we do have a section that talks about that. We have watershed prioritization. The strategy outlines our priority watersheds. There's a discussion on all the different water quality monitoring programs through IDEM and through USGS and through private entities. There are strategies and practices for addressing non-point source pollution and point source pollution. We have our Indiana section on our Indiana Science Assessment. We have a section on all the programs, projects, and initiatives that support nutrient reduction, and as well as all the agricultural conservation initiatives that we have going on. We have a section that discusses how we measure our impacts, and then we have a section that lays out our goals and action items in a table format. So partnerships, the Indiana State Nutrient Reduction Strategy does highlight the importance of the partnerships, and I've shown here on a slide all the many partners that we do work with. As I mentioned before, a lot of the states know the work that goes into creating and developing their state strategies. And so having a partnership of people to work with together is the way that we accomplish this task. We work with both public and private companies and organizations and agencies. Like I mentioned, we have our state nutrient reduction strategy work group, and with our recent update, we were able to expand the makeup of our work group, strategy work group, to include even more partners and stakeholders that we have had previously. So our work group is made up of about 20 different individuals and groups, private companies, watershed basin commissions. We even have Beck's Hybrids that is on our work group. So we're able to have a private company. So lots of people share in this task. So now moving on to our watershed prioritization, we know that having priority watersheds is important for achieving the greatest impact towards sediment and nutrient load reductions. The map shown on this slide here is what our previous priority watersheds were in Indiana. These were originally chosen in 2011, and they were situated along the Wabash River. These watersheds here are along the Wabash River, and then they were along the White River as well, that they all drain down to the same point there near New Harmony, that site I was mentioning earlier. So since it's been over a decade since the priority excuse me, watersheds were chosen, we decided our strategy work group decided that we needed to do an exercise to reassess all of the watersheds in the state. So a prioritization subcommittee of the strategy work group was developed, and this group developed a standardized data-driven process to prioritize all all 38 Huck 8 watersheds in the state according to a tiered system. The subcommittee developed a 6-factor multi-category evaluation framework, and you see those are listed there on the slide. And these 6 factors were used to score all of the watersheds and rank them. And then, each watershed was scored or ranked from 1 to 5, with 1 being the lowest priority and 5 being the highest priority. Each of those factors reflects a unique aspect of watershed condition or a risk related to nutrient pollution. As part of this exercise, each of the 6 factors were assigned to one of 3 categories. So our categories were water resource protection, and these are factors that identified whether watersheds had if the watersheds had water resources like surface water and groundwater that are valuable or susceptible due to high levels of nutrients. And then our water quality factor identified the current state of the water quality within the Huck 8 watersheds, focused on water quality as it relates to nutrients. And then we took that and analyzed it separately for nitrogen specific and phosphorus specific prioritization. And then our third category was our Indiana Conservation Partnership Conservation Adoption. So this was used the information was used from our conservation adoption to identify the amount of practices that were adopted based on the sediment saved and its effect on water quality in each of the watersheds. The scoring and ranking process that we use is described further in a methodology document that can be found in an appendix to our most recent strategy, or can also be found on our strategy website, which I've listed here. There are included here a link to that methodology document. I'm not going to go into the details of how we did that, but I did include here. This is the map of the overall results of our watershed prioritization, scoring and ranking that we did when we were taking all of the factors and categories into consideration. So we did 4 tiers. The first tier being the red watersheds that scored high in all 3 categories, and then our tier 2 watersheds are the more darker orange, and those watersheds scored high in 2 of the 3 categories. And then our tier 3, the orange watersheds, those watersheds scored high in 3 of the categories, in 1 of the 3 categories, excuse me. And then tier 4 watersheds, the yellow ones, those did not score high in any of the 3 watersheds. They were still had some scoring to them. They just did not score high in each of the categories. So, okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about I think I just have 1 slide here of the water quality monitoring section that's included in our strategy. Lots of good information within this section, where we talk about all of the water quality monitoring programs that we have in the state of Indiana. Most of them are done through the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, with some partnership with the USGS. But through IDEM, they have their surface water quality monitoring programs. And this is a program that's guided by the Indiana Water Quality Monitoring Strategy that they update every 4 to 5 years. And then they have their probabilistic monitoring program where they rotate they have a 9-year rotating cycle on doing probabilistic monitoring. And then just another example of one of their programs, they have their fixed station monitoring network, which has 165 sites around the state where they collect water quality monitoring data. That data is very important data, and it's actually what we are using within our science assessment to help determine trends. And then other water quality monitoring programs, they have the groundwater monitoring network. They have a lake monitoring data program. There's a program to collect harmful algal bloom information. They've got the TMDL program, the 303D list. There's lots of different programs that go on under IDEM. Excuse me. Okay, so then next, the strategy that the strategy has a section that talks about what can be done to reduce point source and non-point source pollution. So I put just a little bit of that information here on the slides, tried to condense it here. Lots of information in those sections, but we do have strategies and objectives listed that that explain what can be done in different landscapes. So we've got urban landscapes, we've got rural landscapes. On this slide here, it shows some of the urban and rural strategies or objectives that can be done. So for instance, repair and restore stream bank stabilization, restore and can reconnect riparian wetlands and floodplains, install two-stage ditches, install drainage water management, wetland restorations, putting in urban areas, installing rain gardens, green roofs. Lots of information that can be done here, both point source and non-point source pollution strategies. And then on the next slide, this lists some of the strategy objectives that can be done in agricultural landscapes. So again, restoring and repairing stream bank stabilization, ensuring that livestock farms are in compliance with our confined feeding operation rules, as well as fertilizer certification rules, promoting manure storage management, manure storage and manure management, repairing broken tiles, adopting nutrient management practices, including adopting or employing the 4R nutrient stewardship concept, and emphasizing soil health. And with all of this, we do emphasize within our strategy that a system of conservation practices is what is important. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but each practice treats nutrients differently. So a system or a conservation of practices treats nutrient runoff more effectively. So we try to stress that several times throughout our strategy. And as we talk about our strategy to stakeholders and the public, we try to stress that as well. Within this section, we also do have a list of practices that can be used. On this slide here is just a few of the practices that can be used. The section does give some explanations on what the practices are and how they can be implemented. So I just want to put it, this is just a quick slide here just to show you that we do have some of these practices listed within our strategy. So lots of information, as you guys know, from working on strategies yourselves in the different states. So now I'm going to move on to talking about our science assessment, why we have a science assessment, and why it's important. When we were starting this process, we basically were asking ourselves two main questions around water quality and nutrients. The first one is how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment are leaving or entering the state in our waters, and in what direction are we trending? And then the second question is how effective are the conservation practices that we recommend and implement in Indiana at reducing nutrients? if we're going to recommend to farmers and landowners specific practices for them to use to reduce erosion, reduce nutrient impacts, and improve water quality, it's good for us to know the effectiveness of those practices that we recommend. So the science assessment works on this and is a huge part of our strategy. And the trends work that we do through the science assessment also helps us to focus our implementation. You know, once we find out which practices are most effective, we can put those practices in the watersheds where we need the most work. So our trends work is very important for this as well. So our science assessment is excuse me, it's carried out by a core team, what we call our core team, that's made up of several different organizations and conservation agencies in the state. So it's made up of the Indiana State Department of Agriculture, the Indiana Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Indiana chapter of the Nature Conservancy, the Indiana Agricultural Nutrient Alliance, the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, and the Purdue University College of Agriculture. So there are 6 of us that work together on a core team that pretty much help carry out and the science assessment and keep it moving. So this is a group where we meet bi-weekly to help or to work on anything within our strategy and keep it moving forward. So I've included a QR code in our website on this slide here that will take you to our science assessment website that does need updated. So to talk a little bit about the components within our science assessment, we have 2 main components. The first one is to determine historic and ongoing nutrient load trends leaving the state, also, or by watershed basin, excuse me, by all the watershed basins that are within our strategy. This is led by ISDA personnel, but with support from IDEM, USGS, and the Nature Conservancy. The work that we did with this was completed and it is available in a written report on our website. There's a QR code there that will take you to that report. That report was done a couple of years ago and includes data only up through 2023. We have done a reanalysis of the data to get trends up through using 2025 data. And that is information that is available on or through our strategy and on our website as well. And then the second component is to improve the current method for determining the sediment and nutrient load reductions from conservation practices, including dissolved nutrients, and determine the efficiency of conservation practices in reducing nutrient loads. The process that we currently use in Indiana is a process that has worked for us for many years. Since 2011, we've done this process using the Region 5, the EPA Region 5 nutrient load reduction model. However, it's a model that does not account for dissolved nutrients or for practices that are not tied to sediment. So we have been wanting to, for several years now, to improve that method so we're capturing more than just practices tied to sediment. So that's was the main reason for starting this this component of this strategy. So to talk a little bit about the component 1 of our science assessment, we determined nutrient loads using the WRDS model. I mentioned that earlier, how we wanted to mirror what the Hypoxia task force was using. So we do use the USGS WRDS model. We use water quality monitoring data from the IDEM fixed station network monitoring sites. So those 165 sites I mentioned around the state, data is used from that network of sites. And then we also use USGS discharge and stream gauge data from that network. The parameters that we looked at for this analysis was total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and total suspended solids. And the analysis we did on 20 sites in the state. We selected 20 sites. 9 of them were export sites, so those sites that are leaving our state. 3 of those are import sites, so sites where we have water entering our state, and then we have 8 interior sites, so those that are within the basins in our state. And these site locations were determined by the desire to know the load from all of our major rivers and by what water quality data was available. Originally, when we started this work, we wanted to not only mirror what the task force was using with the WORDIS model, but also try to mirror the time frame that's used for the baseline. But we were not able to do that within Indiana because the time frame of the water quality when it was available or when it was started and done is all over the place. So we have to just use what is out there. So some of the results that came out of this work, what we did is we took like this is an example of what you'll see in the report, but we took there are 5 sites in the state that drain to the Mississippi River, 5 sites that we analyzed as part of this process, and we combined the data from those 5 sites to show the loads that are contributed to the Mississippi River from Indiana. And then the results from that are shown on the left-hand side, with combining all of those sites. And then we did the same thing for all the sites that are within the Michigan Lake Michigan Basin, as well as the Western Lake Erie Basin. And you can see here we did have a downward trend in our nitrogen and kind of a static trend in our phosphorus. And then this same process we applied to all of the individual sites that were selected. So this was done for all 20 individual sites. And this is an example of some of what you'll see, or the results that you'll see in our report. This is for the New Harmony site. I did show this one earlier. This is the one I mentioned before, but those graphs there, I showed only the total nitrogen. Here you can see the flow normalized concentrations and the loads for all 3 parameters, for the total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and the total suspended solids. So we here's an example of that same process done for the Kankakee watershed. So this is the up in the northwest part of the state that drains to Illinois. Excuse me. So a majority of our sites, we are seeing a downward trend in the total nitrogen. A few of them are going up, a few are going down. So, but the majority of them we do see a downward trend. And that is our goal within the state of Indiana, is to continue to see a downward trend in each of the basins and that we analyze as part of this process. In those areas where we are not seeing a downward trend, we know that more work needs to be done in those watersheds. So that is where this kind of information is valuable for us. The Kankakee site here, you see total nitrogen is kind of up and down, and then the total phosphorus actually has gone down. So that's good for that. And and I mentioned how a majority of the sites, or excuse me, a majority of the sites are seeing a downward trend in nitrogen. For phosphorus, majority of them we're actually seeing a stagnant trend. Few going up, few going down, but most of them we're seeing a pretty stagnant trend. So why that is, it's hard to know, but we do know that we need to do more work in those watersheds. We did take this information and we created an online tool, online interactive tool where you can go and you can look at all of this information and download some of this information. So here, these are just some snapshots of what is on that tool. Unfortunately, currently the tool is broken. and we've got some fixes that we're trying to figure out, but soon we hope to be getting that back up. But you can kind of see from these snapshots what kind of information you can get from that. So, and what the graphs will show. So. Okay, moving on to the second component of our science assessment. This is the one where I mentioned that is about quantifying the effects of our conservation practices related to how we want to improve the method of how we track our these reductions. So the goal is to address the effects of the conservation practices on nitrogen loss, on phosphorus loss, and on sediment loss, and then also to show the reductions in both surface runoff and within tile drainage where applicable. And then also for applicable practices, again, we want to express the reductions in two ways. One would be percent reduction and the other in pounds per acre. This work is benefited by all the previous science assessments that have been done by Illinois, Minnesota, and Iowa. We're using a lot of the information from those science assessments, as well as some of the new research that has gone on in Indiana. But definitely the work that has been done in previous science assessments has been very, very beneficial. And a lot of this work with component 2 of our science assessment is done at Purdue University with folks there, as well as from other universities around the state. But it is housed at Purdue um, with Jane Frankenberger, and she's our main person within Purdue that we work with. And part of that work, she developed or put together a what we call the Midwest Nutrients Group that meets monthly to discuss important topics related to this work and share information. The group consists of researchers, scientists, experts from Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin, I believe. If I'm missing anyone, I apologize, but I believe right now that's as well as in Indiana. I believe those are the 5 states that are a part of that group, but it is very interesting. I enjoy being a part of that group and learning from all of those experts. So for the science assessment, there is a list of 25 practices that were selected to be a part of this assessment work. Most of the work right now is focused on the list of practices that are in the first column under phase 1, and then a few of the practices listed in the second column we are working on now, or I shouldn't say we, I should say Purdue is working on right now. And we've taken the practices and kind of grouped them into different categories of soil health practices, nutrient management practices, infield and edge of field practices, practices that manage water and drainage, and then practices that change our cropping system. So we kind of grouped our list of practices into categories. So that's what is shown here on this slide. I mentioned that the science assessment, the second component, science, excuse me, I'm getting tongue-tied, that the component 2 work of our science assessment is housed at Purdue University. But I also mentioned how we do have a core team of individuals that works together to help carry out our science assessment, make sure that that work is moving forward. We meet every 2 weeks. But on top of that, we also have what we call our science committee. And this is a team of experts and researchers working together to get agreement and consensus on the effectiveness of the practices. So in the process of the systematic review and how we go through the whole analyzation process, once we get to the findings of the effectiveness of the practices, the science committee comes in and they vote and they agree and have consensus on our practices. So I just mentioned systematic review. This is the steps that we go through, or that Purdue goes through. The core team, I guess, we go through it as well, for this whole process. Um, we first we agreed on the definitions for all of our practices, all definitions that all of our stakeholders can accept and use. The second step is to identify the studies that can provide the data. So we started with published reviews and then added more recent studies from a Google Scholar search, using relevant search terms. And then the third step is to select the studies. So we identify them and then they're selected, and studies that meet the criteria that we developed for inclusion. So in other words, studies that must have particular criteria, such as it being based on field measurements, comparing runoff and drain flow from a control to a treatment site, and then also, sites or studies that are conducted in the Midwest, and then areas with similar soils, climate, and crop types than from what of what Indiana has. And then the fourth step there is to extract all of the data from those studies and put them into a database. And then step 5 is to analyze that data to quantify the effectiveness. And this includes working with our science committee members that I mentioned to get agreement and consensus on those results. And then lastly, our sixth step in this is to report and share out those findings. And we are creating fact sheets and documents right now to help report out findings for some of the practices. So this is an overall description of how the steps that we take in going through the analysis. I'm not going to go into detail of how all of this is done, because that is work that Purdue does mostly, and I want to leave that expertise of describing that to them, leave that expertise to them. So, but I will mention just a couple of things that about those steps. And one is with our practice definitions. We did, for each practice, like I mentioned, we developed definitions and criteria for inclusion into the assessment. And the core team developed a public version of our definitions, put them into a document so that we could share that out and let the public know what we are using for our definitions of conservation practices. This is available on our Indiana Science Assessment website. Version 1 still just has the first 10 practices that we chose in phase 1. A version 2 of our definitions for the other 25 practices that were listed, that I had listed on that slide under phase 2. We are in the process of working on version 2 to include the definitions for those practices as well. So soon I hope to have a definitions document that will describe all 25 practices. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is, within one of those steps of the assessment is how we analyze and data to quantify the effectiveness. So I've just got a couple of examples here. This one is the findings that came out of the work for the cover crops. And through that, it was found that nitrogen is sharply reduced by cover crops, shown with strong evidence. Reduction occurs in both tile drain flow and surface runoff. And then studies of nitrogen are in the form of nitrate. And then for phosphorus, the impacts from cover crop implementation are mixed, with limited data showing both increases and reductions, in phosphorus. We have found that there's insufficient number of studies to provide enough evidence-based information to determine what the effects of phosphorus are from cover crops. So more work needs to be done on that. We're finding through this work that there's definitely gaps in data. So it's valuable for finding gaps as well. But this table down here shows just some of the findings from that work that Purdue has done. The other example that I have up here is for the findings for drainage water management. With nitrogen loss and both phosphorus loss, the information is there for drainage water management and nitrogen loss. It shows that it's consistently reduced, and there is strong evidence for this, and there's been a lot of research done for this practice, and so we're able to get some pretty strong data for this practice. So that's good for nitrogen anyway, but for phosphorus, there's just insufficient amount of data to be able to, phosphorus loss is just not as studied as much as nitrogen loss is within this practice. So, actually within many practices. So there's just a couple of examples of, some of the work that Purdue has been doing. And then I wanted to just briefly mention here the products that are going to come out of our science assessment. And the first one here is, like I've already mentioned, the practice definitions. That's definitely one of our products. Second is we are going to have an updated tool that we will use to calculate practice effectiveness. I mentioned that we have a current method where we use the Region 5 nutrient load reduction model. We want to expand and improve on that tool to be able to capture more practices. So there's a student at Purdue that is helping us with the development of this, who is working under Jane. And so progress is happening with this tool. And then the third product is we want to have a table that will report out the effectiveness of each of those practices. So it will be similar to what you've seen in some other science assessments, but that is a desired product for us. And then the fourth one I've got listed there is we are developing practice sheets for each practice. They don't specifically look like what I have here on the slide, but there is a lot of work being done right now to get those practice sheets completed and available. The Indiana Nutrient Research and Education Program, this is a new program that we created using the Gulf Hypoxia program dollars. It is a program we created to continue the work of this science assessment. We wanted to be able to expand upon it and continue it for many more years than what we originally had funding for. We wanted to be able to keep it going. So we created the INREP program in Indiana. And under this program, I mentioned before a few slides ago when I was talking about some of our findings that we know that there are gaps in some of the data that we need to determine effectiveness. And so one of the things that we have done under this program is we've developed a subgrant program to help increase the availability of data from Indiana research. We've found that by providing these dollars, we are able to get additional studies, and it will help to strengthen the evidence that we're using, or the evidence of the effectiveness of practices. All right, moving away from our science assessment, we do have a section within our strategy that talks about all of the programs that we have that support our nutrient reduction, or excuse me, that support nutrient reductions. There are many programs, many resources, tools that are out there within both our state, and then, as you guys know, there's many federal programs that are available. We have in Indiana, we have point source regulatory programs. We have non-point source regulated programs, such as our items wellhead protection program, the confined feeding operations, concentrated animal feeding operations, stormwater runoff programs. And then we also have several non-point source, non-regulated programs. So those programs traditionally known as the voluntary programs. So we've got several of those in the state that are available. And just to touch on a few of those, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, I know several states have these. A program within Indiana is to enroll 100,000 acres of buffer land on water bodies and to restore wetlands and floodplain areas in Indiana. This is a program that is available statewide in every county. That is new as of September or October of 2024. It is now available throughout the state. We also have our Clean Water Indiana program, which is responsible for providing funds to our soil and water conservation districts, and then also provides funds for grants to both the districts and to outside organizations. And then we have our Cover Crop Premium Discount Program. This is a program that provides incentive or a discount to landowners to their each year's crop insurance. And it's a $5 per acre premium discount. And then we have our Mississippi River Basin Soil Sampling Program, where we incentivize farmers to conduct soil sampling. And I guess I shouldn't say incentivize, but we help provide free a free or reduced cost of conducting soil sampling on their farms. Those are just 4 of the programs that are available in the State Department of Agriculture. We have another cost share program that we are working on implementing that hopefully later this year that will include some of the more non-traditional practices that don't always get funded by federal programs like IQIP. So we're looking for an additional cost share program that we could maybe try to supplement some of those practices that EQIP is not able to cover. And then other state programs within the Department of Natural Resources and within IDEM. I've got those listed here. We have a Lake and River Enhancement Program, which boater registration fees, those dollars are used to apply for grants to reduce non-point source sediments into lakes and rivers. Yeah, sorry. And then IDEM, we've got the 319 program and the Clean Water Act Section 106 supplemental funding, which does help to fund our water quality monitoring strategy as well as the groundwater monitoring network that I mentioned earlier. This slide here, just I'm not going to go into detail here. It just lays out the gamut of federal programs that's available for landowners. We also have a section that talks about all of the projects or initiatives that we have to support nutrient reduction. We have many of them in the state. We have our Indiana Conservation Partnership Soil Health Philosophy that endorses the 4 key soil health principles and the objectives of soil health improvement. We have a systems approach of conservation practices. This is where we promote the system of conservation practices rather than the adoption of just one. So I've mentioned this before. There is actually a document that or a publication that stresses the importance and discusses what it means to have a system of conservation practices. So that's another area I mentioned that it's talked about several times throughout that we emphasize it several times throughout our strategy, and this is one area where we do that. We also have the Conservation Cropping Systems Initiative, which is a program of the Indiana Conservation Partnership, and its mission is to improve soil health through education and outreach efforts. And then the Indiana Agricultural Nutrient Alliance is a group of commodities, conservation organizations and agencies. Purdue University is a part of it. It's an organization that is dedicated to keeping Indiana farmers at the forefront of management practices, both nutrient management and soil health practices. We want to keep farmers at the forefront of that to know what's always going on and it's available out there. So the IANA is a group that we work with a lot within the state of Indiana. and they're heavily involved in the work of the science assessment as well. And then just a couple of more programs there, the 4-hour nutrient stewardship certification program, and then as well as our Indiana small farms conservation. Oh, this slide just talks about the ICP soil health philosophy that I mentioned and the systems approach to conservation practices, and shows that publication that we have available through Indiana NRCS. The goals and action items within our strategy, I'll just mention this real quick. We have 5 categories within this table that explains what we have going on in the state, the actions that we have under each of these categories. We have an overarching goal under these categories with action items listed under that goal. This helps to provide accountability and a work plan for us, and helps us to track key accomplishments. This section here, we just have a quick section here that talks about what an everyday person can do to protect water quality. So whether you live in an urban area or in the country, these are just day-to-day things that you can do. So we do have a short section in our strategy about this. Just real quick, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but
so we are just a little over.
Are we? Okay. Okay. So the measuring impacts, we have many ways that we measure impacts. We have our conservation cover crop transects. We do the sediment nutrient load reduction tracking. We have interactive web watershed tools such as story maps, success stories, things like that. We do performance measures monitoring. And then another way we track is through regulatory framework. So I'm actually going to leave it at that. I'll skip a few of these. It was just some information about some more specifics on how we track. So I will leave it as questions, and I'll move here to this slide.
Well, thank you for that presentation. Before we get to questions, I just want to remind everybody that this seminar, as well as all of the seminars in this series, are recorded and have been posted to the INRC website. And you can either go to the web address here or use the QR code to get to our videos. All right, so for questions, which practices of the ones you've covered are the most popular in Indiana, and why do you think those are popular?
Okay, which part? Okay, I'm gonna go. Sorry if I make you dizzy. Okay, this is the list of practices that we are covering with our science assessment. The ones under the first phase, we have done analysis for the no-till, reduced tillage, and cover crops. The under nitrogen management, there's been phosphorus rate and nitrogen rate that has been done, and then drainage water management is being worked on. Grass filter strips has been worked on a little bit. There's still a little more work that needs to be done under that one. And then there's been a lot of work done with wetlands as well. So that's what we've covered so far. And we really developed this list of practices that we cover based on what's promoted by agencies in Indiana, what is most widespread use, and kind of having an idea what kind of sufficient data might have been available within studies or literature.
And then, is there any publicly available information on either the number of practices that have been implemented or maybe the number of acres that have been treated?
Yes, we do have that information on our website, where I'm assuming, I'm going to make an assumption that this is related to how we track our sediment nutrient load reductions from our practices. We do track the number of practices that we implement, and I know I didn't share this during during the presentation, but in 2024 there were over 46,000 conservation and farm BMPs that were implemented, and 19,000 of those practices we were able to model to quantify the reductions in sediment and nutrients. So yes, we do have that information on our website. I think it might be part of a tool that's broken. We've had a couple tools recently on our website that have broken because of our state making some changes to how things are shown. And so unfortunately, we've got some work to make some fixes. But if you do want, if that information is desired, we can get that information for you. You just contact me and I can get you that information.
And it was interesting to see that there's some non-point source practices for urban and suburban areas. Has there been a lot of interest in those practices?
Actually, yes, there has. We have a lot of our soil and water conservation districts work with landowners in putting practices in suburban and urban areas. We've got and then we also have an initiative within the state that's called our Small Farms Conservation, and there's a lot of interest and a lot of work done with landowners on what they can do in their urban gardens. um, and so, yes, there has been a lot of interest in the state. Our small farms programs has really lots of information on their website, and that is a program that kicked off and really has a lot of interest. Yeah.
And then let's see, for your fixed station monitoring sites, what parameters are measured at those sites?
That is a good question. I know that nitrogen and phosphorus and sediment um, is collected at those sites because that's what we use for our trends work. Um, and they do collect many other parameters, but I'm not exactly sure what all of those are, since I'm not involved directly in that work. So that's a good question. I'm sorry, I can't answer it completely.
All right, well, that's all I'm seeing for the questions. So I want to thank you again. It was a great presentation and great to hear what's going on in Indiana. So I'm going to stop the recording.